Hi, my name is Elliot Cohen, and I'm Dean of Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. And I would like to welcome you to this first lecture in the course Rough Magic, Shakespeare on Power. What we're going to be doing in this course is looking at what Shakespeare has to teach us about political power and the men and women who seek it. The title of the course is taken from The Tempest, in which at the very end, Prospero, the magician who rules over a desert island, says, "But this rough magic I here abjure, I'll break my staff, bury it certain fathoms in the earth, and deeper than did ever plummets sound, I'll drown my book." Prospero has decided to give up, in other words, on political power, and we'll explore why people do that in the very last section of the course. Now, you might be asking yourself, why would the Dean of SAIS, who has a background chiefly as a military historian and as a student of, and to some extent a participant in the making of American foreign policy, be teaching a course on Shakespeare? Some of you may know that, in fact, I intend to write a book, and a lot of what's in this course is really the raw material for this book. And a friend of mine once said to me, when I raised this issue with him, he would say, he's a very well-known English literature professor, he said, "You know, Elliot, I think everybody should write a book about Shakespeare." Maybe so. But the truth is, the reason why I want to do this and why I think I can bring something special to the study of Shakespeare is I'm not a literature professor. I would never claim to be. That's not my area of scholarship. But I have spent my entire career studying political power and political people, studying war and military people. And because of my opportunities to serve in government and simply by being part of the Washington scene, I've seen presidents and prime ministers. I've met royalty, foreign ministers, generals. I've seen battlefields. I've seen the corridors of power. And so I think I have a somewhat different perspective than perhaps a literature professor might have. Okay, but why Shakespeare? Well, I've always loved Shakespeare, but for me, the moment at which I realized that there's something to be done here by way of a course and ultimately a book was when my wife and I went to see a performance of Henry VIII. This is a play that's not put on all that frequently. Some people even question whether Shakespeare wrote all of it, although the part I'm about to show you, he pretty clearly did. And there's a moment when Cardinal Wolsey, who has been Henry VIII's chief minister, is suddenly deposed, and he's just shocked. Let's look at that. "Farewell, long farewell to all my greatness. This is the state of man. Today he puts forth the tender leaves of hopes. Tomorrow blossoms and bears his blushing honors thick upon him. The third day comes a frost, a killing frost." And then he continues, after he describes falling, "I have ventured like little wanton boys that swim on bladders this many summers in a sea of glory, but far beyond my depth." It's a very dramatic speech. And he's saying to his faithful assistant, Thomas Cromwell, who's features in a wonderful trilogy now by Hilary Mantel, that in some ways he had it coming. Well, I thought to myself when I saw that, when I heard that speech, I know that guy. There are a lot of people in Washington and in other capitals who swim in a sea of glory and find themselves beyond their depth, and all of a sudden they fall never to hope again. It's not at all an uncommon story. And that really informed my reading of Shakespeare thereafter. and not just my reading of Shakespeare. One of the things that's striking about Shakespeare is how many politicians were absolutely entranced by him. One of them was Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln probably never saw Shakespeare performed until he became president, but he did read Shakespeare very closely, and he was absolutely fascinated by him. Towards the end of the Civil War, he was visiting a battlefront, and he came back on a steamer heading to Washington, D.C., and he began talking about the play Macbeth, and he pulled out a copy of it and began reading it to his colleagues who were with him on the boat. And this is the part he quoted: "Better be with the dead, whom we to gain our peace have sent to peace, than on the torture of the mind to lie in restless ecstasy. Duncan is in his grave. After life's fitful fever he sleeps well. Treason has done his worst. Nor steel nor poison, malice domestic, foreign levy, nothing can touch him further." Well, 5 days after that trip, Abraham Lincoln went to Ford's Theater, and by the end of the play, of course, treason had indeed done its worst. Of course, there's a great irony here. Lincoln was assassinated by a formidable Shakespearean actor who was obsessed with Shakespeare. And it's not just the great politicians, or let us say the good politicians, as Lincoln undoubtedly was, who are fascinated by Shakespeare. The Nazis were fascinated by Shakespeare. And in fact, the play Coriolanus, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, which is about a Roman general who turns on Rome, was performed and given a great deal of attention by the Nazi leadership. In this case, we might want to ask ourselves, what did Lincoln see in this? Was it perhaps a reflection of his own ambition and his misgivings about it? Because that's really, in many ways, the theme of Macbeth. Did Lincoln, too, perhaps feel the torture of the mind? Well, we'll explore all those things. The way this course is going to be structured is a series of pretty short lectures like this one, at the end of which I'll give you something to think about, and I'll suggest something that you might want to look at before the next lecture. After every 3 lectures, after each of these lectures, there will be an online chat where people will be able to speak with one another about the play and about their thoughts about it or about the issues that we've raised. And then after every 3 lectures, there'll be a 1-hour live session, which I will be interacting with you and responding to your comments, and I look forward to that. So let me then move to where I'd like us to go for the next lecture. It's a really fun exercise to do what I suggest here, Googling a political figure in Shakespeare and seeing what you come up with. I'll be curious to know what you find. And then in the next lecture, I'm going to ask, what is it that we think Shakespeare really understood about politics? And for that, let me suggest that you read up about the Essex Rebellion against Queen Elizabeth, and you'll see that Shakespeare, in fact, ended up being embroiled in politics. So, I look forward to working with you on this course and to sharing my insights and hearing yours, and I'll see you at the next lecture. Hi, this is Elliot Cohen, and I want to welcome you back to Rough Magic, Shakespeare on Power. The topic of today's lecture is what Shakespeare knew about politics. There are those who have read Shakespeare and who have said his understanding of the court politics of his time and of previous British history was so good that he couldn't have just been an actor and a playwright. He must actually have been the pen name of some nobleman of some kind. We know that that's not true. We know that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, that the theatrical world of his time was pretty small. We have actually lots of records from Shakespeare. We know that he was very careful about what he put on paper, or if he was not careful, then nothing has come down of a political nature. He was writing at a really fraught time. This was a time when, of course, Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth's father, had separated from the Catholic Church. There were tremendous divisions between Catholics and Protestants. There were conspiracies. This was a time you made a mistake and you could end up in the Tower. But it's also the case that Shakespeare knew courts. There were two main theatrical companies in London, the Lord Chamberlain's Men and the Lord Admiral's Men. Shakespeare was with the Lord Chamberlain's Men. We know that he routinely performed for senior officials at the court and indeed for the monarchs themselves, Elizabeth I and then James I. And we knew that this actually cut very close to contemporary politics. The most famous case is when the Lord Chamberlain's Men were asked to perform at the home of the Earl of Essex, who had been a favorite of Queen Elizabeth I, but who was involved in a conspiracy, was leading a conspiracy to overthrow her. And later on that same year, this is what Queen Elizabeth said: "I am Richard II, know ye not that?" Well, the play that Shakespeare and his players have been asked to perform was indeed Richard II, which is about an incompetent monarch being deposed by a much more competent nobleman. The Earl of Essex, of course, ended up on the block. He was apparently the last man to be beheaded at the Tower of London, and it took 3 strokes before the executioner was able to lop off his head. So, we know that Shakespeare was involved in the courts and he saw them, but what is it that he saw? I think the key thing to remember about Shakespeare is he is first and foremost a student of character, and that's part of what makes him so universal. That's why there are versions of Shakespeare in really every language on earth. That's why there's great Japanese movies by Akira Kurosawa, which are basically about Shakespeare. It's because they're studies of character. And if there's one thing that we have learned about politics, it is indeed that character matters. But I would say that there's something else that's really important to understand about Shakespeare and that explains why he has so much to teach us. Shakespeare was, above all, I would say, a student of courts. That is to say, political situations where you have a very powerful figure at the center and radiating out from that circles of power, as it were. And there are always people who've been in it, and there are always people who want to get inside it. In the play Cymbeline, there's a wonderful passage between a retired old nobleman who is exiled from the court, and he's bringing up 2 young princes who don't quite know that they're princes. And he's basically telling them it's not as much fun as it looks. There are a lot of wonderful pieces of this of this dialogue with the young princes, particularly where he says, "The art of the court as hard to leave as keep, whose top to climb is certain falling, or so slippery that the fear's as bad as falling." So Belarius, who's the one who's speaking, knows it's not what it's cut out to be. It's not what you think. And the boys respond that may be true, but we still want to be, as the saying goes, in the room where the deals are made. Maybe this is fine for you living out here in a cave, but we really want to see what politics is really like. Well, this idea of politics as a court, I think, is really extraordinarily powerful. Most hierarchical organizations, companies, universities, have something of the feature of a court. There's a number 1, there may be a number 2, there's a whole bunch of number 3s and number 4s, and there are people who are jostling for power and for influence. And there's a second idea in Shakespeare which is very powerful, and that is that politics is theater. Shakespeare, not surprisingly perhaps, had a powerful, powerful sense of the way in which theater is a metaphor for much of our life, and it can be extraordinarily powerful. In fact, in Hamlet, there's a very famous passage where Hamlet, whose father had been murdered by his uncle, decides, in essence, to out his uncle and his mother, whom the uncle has married, by putting on a play. And of course, this famous speech ends, "The play's the thing, wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king." Well, so too in politics. There is frequently a director, actors, a script, an audience, a stage. And once you think about that metaphor, it really explains a lot of how political people behave. And we'll see in Shakespeare's plays, there are some people who don't act very well, but then there are some who are masters. And the one that we'll spend the most time with will be Henry V, who, as we will see, is an extraordinary actor, but he's more than that, he's a director. He's moving people around on a stage. He's written all the stage directions. In a way, he's written the script as well. I think you'll find if you reflect on this metaphor, once you have it down, it'll be very hard to let go of it. So let me conclude with some thoughts for the next lecture. Ask yourself whether it's possible to be an effective leader without being something of an actor. And is that a problem? Or maybe it's not. And then next time, what I want to do is talk about a particular tool that Shakespeare uses, and that's the soliloquy. That speech that's given either to oneself or to the audience, which is in some ways the most powerful weapon in Shakespeare's arsenal. And I've suggested to you one particular soliloquy that we'll spend a good bit of time with. I look forward to seeing you at the next lecture. Hi, this is Elliot Cohen, and welcome back to Rough Magic Shakespeare on Power. The topic of this lecture is the soliloquy, and periodically in this course, what I'm going to do is take a bit of a break and look at some of the techniques that Shakespeare uses to explore the theme of power, people who exercise power, people who desire to exercise power. Now, the particular technique that I'm going to talk about today is probably not one that Shakespeare invented, but it is certainly one that he has mastery of, the soliloquy. Soliloquy is a moment when an actor gives a speech, speaking perhaps to themselves, but more frequently to the audience, in which they reveal who they think they are and what they think is going on. They may deceive themselves, to be sure, in a variety of ways, but a soliloquy is a moment where you don't lie. That is, deliberately tell a falsehood. It's a rendering of the world as it's seen by your inmost eye. It is usually delivered to the audience, although not always. It's what the actors call breaking the fourth wall. That is to say, the invisible wall that separates the stage from the audience, and it can be extremely powerful. For those of you who've seen the series House of Cards, it's exactly what Kevin Spacey playing Frank Underwood does. And in fact, Kevin Spacey was playing Richard III just before he went to House of Cards. Richard is one of Shakespeare's most fascinating villains, and one of the things that's disturbing about the play Richard III is we find ourselves sympathizing with him in a certain way or laughing at his jokes. And really the way Shakespeare does this is through the soliloquy. So what I'd like to do in this lecture is walk you through a soliloquy that Richard gives actually before Richard III in Henry VI, Part 3, Act 3, Scene 2. And what's happened is that his brother, in the course of the English Civil War, has become king. He has made a gracious remark about Lady Grey, who is the widow of one of the nobles who had been fighting on the other side. It's pretty clear he has some fairly lecherous interests in her. And Richard is watching all of this, and he's thinking about Edward, he's thinking about his other brother Clarence, he's thinking about his nephews. And so he begins here. He begins with envy. Edward will use women honorably. Would he were wasted, marrow, bones, and all. It's clear not just that he lacks fraternal feeling, it's clear that there's an element of envy directed towards his brother, and it's not just about power, it's also In some ways, it's envy about sex. Richard then begins to muse about his own ambition. And I think the thing to notice here is this is not a undignified or particularly unworthy depiction of an ambitious politician. They have a great dream for themselves. They think themselves very capable, but they have no idea of how they're going to get where they want to go. And it is deeply distressing to them. And he knows that in many ways the odds are against him. So the question then is, well, is there an alternative? What other pleasure can the world afford? I'll make my heaven in a lady's lap. And this is really a pretty cruel piece of self-examination here. Shakespeare portrays Richard as hunchbacked, withered arm. In truth, probably Richard had scoliosis, but that's about it. But what's striking here is that he knows himself to be physically unattractive to women, but I think in a deeper way, he knows that he is unloved and at some level unlovable. Why love forswore me in my mother's womb. And it's possible actually to feel sorry for Richard at this point. And am I then a man to be beloved? Oh, monstrous fault to harbor such a thought. Well, what are the alternatives? The only alternative is to pursue the crown. Not that he has any particular idea of what he wants to do when he achieves it, but he wants the crown and nothing else will do. He'll account this world but hell. And he uses the word that impaled, that his misshaped trunk that bears this head be round impaled with a glorious crown. That usually when something's impaled, it's not particularly nice. From there, he moves to this passage, which is extremely claustrophobic. He's like one lost in a wood, and he can't find the open air, and he's torn by the thorns and is tearing the thorns. And he is saying that although he thinks he can get there by subtle and sophisticated ways, that's where he'll come out, he's ready to get there simply with a bloody axe. He'll do whatever it takes. And then the mood shifts yet again, because he does think he can get there subtly, because he thinks he's a brilliant actor. Think about the previous lecture. He thinks that he's better than Niccolo Machiavelli. And at the end, that goal that originally seemed completely implausible, he thinks he can do it without difficulty. Can I do this and cannot get a crown? Tut. Were it farther off, I'd pluck it down. So it's an extraordinary depiction of a shifting set of moods. And I think there are a number of things we should take away from that. One is that it is really important to have a three-dimensional view, even of political characters who we find deeply unappealing. And Richard III is a monster, as Richard III as he then becomes. He is a monster. He is cruel. He is unprincipled. He'll lie. He'll seduce. He'll certainly murder. But we can empathize with him. We can get inside his head. Secondly, his thoughts move. He's not a static figure in any way. He is a complicated human being. And the third thing that I think we understand in this particular case, and that a soliloquy can reveal in a way that very few other theatrical devices can, is how ambition for power can be profoundly corrupting and soul-destroying. And that's really what's happened here. Richard is completely consumed by his desire for power. So that's just one example of how powerful a soliloquy can be. It can be somewhat unnerving because it is a window into a human soul. Let me suggest we follow up with this, if you would, by imagining what kind of soliloquy a powerful figure, present or historical, might give. Richard Nixon actually gave something that was a bit like a soliloquy as he left the White House to get on a helicopter after resigning the presidency. He reflected on who he was and the things he had done wrong, and it was not nearly as eloquent as Richard of Gloucester, but it was quite revealing. And you might want to think about what that a soliloquy by any figure that you care to reflect on might give. And I would suggest writing it down. You can have fun with that. For the next lecture, we're going to move into the second section of the course, and that's on how people acquire power. And of course, the easiest way in a monarchy is to inherit it. Well, we'll be looking at one of the scenes in Richard II. Richard II is a legitimate king, but he is incompetent. He's brilliant. He has magnificent command of the English language, but he makes all kinds of mistakes. And this is a powerful scene in which, among other things, you'll read one of the most extraordinary patriotic evocations of a country that you'll ever hear, and that's John of Gaunt's famous speech. And as you can tell from my notes here, it doesn't end well for Richard II. But more on that next time when we continue Rough Magic.